Chapter 7. It's about time. Here's the quote, actually an internet meme. What do we want? Time travel. When do we want it? It's irrelevant. And here we go, starting with section 1. Working out the kinks. Now, when I first thought about all this stuff, I did what we all do with new ideas. I made the ultimate mistake. I told my friends about it. And after they got done making fun of me nonstop for a few weeks, these were the kinds of responses I eventually got. That would actually make a great book. I'd buy tickets to that movie. A cool episode of Black Mirror. So yeah, they thought it was a clever idea, sure. They even thought it would probably make good science fiction. Obviously. But since it involved time travel stuff, as they called it, they just didn't think it was possible. Because the future hasn't happened yet, and the past is unchangeable. So any kind of time shenanigans was impossible, due to all the obvious problems that this would create. Problems you might have already thought of by now, like the two timelines problem, for instance. The two timelines problem. So, what is the two timelines problem exactly, and why is it such a problem? Well, to understand it, let's imagine that I wanted to resurrect someone right now. Like my cat, Rocky, for instance. Named Rocky Balboa Jones because he liked to bat around crumpled up pieces of paper like he was a boxer training for a big fight. And who passed away when I was 12 years old. And let's say I had a super artificial intelligence in my house right now, as well as a brand new quantum time tunnel opener that just came in the mail. How exactly would this work? Well, obviously, the first thing I would do is open the box and read the instructions to my brand new time portal. Then I would break out my tools and set it all up, IKEA style. And finally, after throwing away all the extra parts I had left over, I would slip on my safety glasses, always wear safety glasses, kids, and open a portal through time in my living room. And maybe have a beer because I would probably be thirsty by this point. Now, as I reached back to nab my cat's consciousness, a thought would occur to me. Where has Rocky's consciousness been this whole time? I mean, it's been years. Was he reincarnated? Did he go to heaven? Did he turn into dust and experience whatever it was that dust experiences? And if I reached back in time and pulled it out of there, what would happen to my cat's consciousness here, wherever it was in my present? I mean, how can something be in the present if I select it out of the past? Obviously, it can't be. And this is what I call the two timelines problem. And once you think of it, it just makes you want to take this whole idea of technological resurrection, crumple it up, and throw it away, because it kind of disproves it. And as I mentioned before, because of thoughts like this, for the most part, I agreed with my friends for a long time. It all did seem impossible. But I continued to keep tabs on experiments involving quantum physics. I kept trying to learn and expand my mind. And eventually, I stumbled across a couple of ideas that started to change my view. Ideas that made me feel technological resurrection was worth thinking about again, after all. Ideas like the cool theory that we're actually in a multiverse. The many worlds theory. Now, anyone who watches science fiction is familiar with the many worlds theory. Alternate realities, parallel universes, multiverse theory. It's got a lot of names. And anytime there's some kind of time travel stuff, this is the go-to theory. So, let's try it out. Let's see if it makes sense. According to this theory, there are many versions of the past, present, and future. And the truth, according to our kooky quantum physicist, is that when we don't observe things, multiple possibilities exist. Well, this is my simplified explanation anyway. And quantum physicists even have a cool name for this. It's called a superposition. And it's only when we observe something that we collapse the possibilities down to one. And that's our timeline. We're stuck with it. Well, guess what? Our consciousness is invisible, isn't it? It's beyond our observation, whatever it is. And even if we are creepily staring at something as it dies, we still can't observe what happens to its consciousness. So, according to this theory, the possibilities are still open. Because I don't know what happened to my cat's consciousness. I didn't see anything. I didn't interact with it after he died at all. The cops could interrogate me until I was blue in the face. My answer would stay the same. I didn't see nothing, copper. So, with this in mind, my super AI could now look back through these possible versions of the past until it found a version where Rocky's consciousness wasn't reincarnated, but rather transplanted through this wormhole and into his new body. And now that my timeline was synced up with this version of the past, where would Rocky's consciousness have been this whole time? Well, now that I collapsed away those other less appealing possibilities, it would have been streaking through a space-time wormhole the whole time, opened up by me in the future. And while 23 years would have passed for me, it would only have seemed like an instant to my cat's consciousness. Neat trick, huh? Also, I think it's important to point out that this isn't all as theoretical as I have been saying. Quantum physicists are already building quantum computers and regularly doing experiments using particles in superpositions. So, now this technological resurrection stuff starts to become possible again. It works forwards and backwards now. And remember, I didn't cook this up. These crazy quantum physicists did. So blame them for the headache that you just got. And why at the moment of death? And finally, we need to talk about this whole moment of death thing. After all, if AIs were able to look back in time and move particles around, why would they need to transplant our consciousness at the moment of death anyway? Why not just change things to prevent us from dying in the first place, right? Or warp our whole bodies into the future to save us? Why be so sneaky about it? Think of it this way. If we use this technology to alter the past, to prevent someone from dying, then why would we be looking back in time trying to prevent them from dying? It's a paradox. Sound the alarm. But what if instead we invisibly retrieve their consciousness from their body at the moment of death? And we only had to take just a few quantum subatomic particles to do it. Nothing would change in the past. The timeline would be unaltered. Maybe a few subatomic particles would wiggle around a bit, but this wouldn't change anything that much. So, it would still make sense for us to be in a room with a super AI trying to resurrect our dead friend. Paradox averted. And remember this, because this idea of working in invisible and mysterious ways will actually become even more important in later chapters, because it's becoming clear now that doing things out of the reach of observation is central to both quantum physics and spirituality. Coincidence? Maybe not. Summing it up. So, no matter how many times we try to dismiss this idea of technological resurrection, it survives. It's still possible. It still makes sense. And while it may be complicated, did any of us really expect to get to the other side and say, how does this universe work? And get a simple answer? Like a little 3-sentence explanation that cleared it all up? I don't think so. And in my opinion, it's only natural that as all of these new technologies and understandings come into our life, we try and use them to make sense out of things that are pretty confusing. After all, hasn't this always been the case? For example, men used to believe that thunder was made by gods, and then we figured out it was electricity. Mankind used to also think infections were caused by evil spirits. But then we learned about microorganisms, and so on and so on. In truth, this has always been the natural progression. What isn't understood is considered spiritual. And then when we figure out what's happening and it becomes science. And you know what? It's no less amazing, is it? Just because we use antibiotics now instead of trying to exorcise out our infections doesn't mean it's not just as awesome when we get better. But as you can probably already tell, this new scientific interpretation for the afterlife has far reaching ramifications, not the least of which is that if we consider this a possibility, we must also start expanding the scientific interpretation to include other phenomena we now think of as spiritual. And furthermore, if we choose to believe that any kind of time travel stuff is possible, then we have to ask ourselves, where is it? Where are all the time travelers? Which brings us to the next challenge to this new idea, this new scientific interpretation of death. If we're living in a multiverse and time is malleable, and minds are getting warped around and stuff, shouldn't there be more evidence of all of this? Well, maybe it's been right in front of us this whole time. That's the end of the chapter. The next chapter is chapter 8, where we talk about some possibilities with time travel and how this might have implications for spiritual ideas.